Okay, hi everybody. Hopefully you're doing great out there. Thank you all for watching. In this video, I'm going to talk about Aristotle on goodness. To this point, when thinking about goodness or thinking about intrinsic goodness or that which is good for its own sake, we've seen how Plato, Socrates take a very virtue-centered view. So they think that virtue is the thing that centrally explains like a life being a good one. So the best human life for someone like Socrates seems to be one whereby people are living virtuously. We're living wisely, courageously, justly, moderately, honestly, generously, etc. So when you think about the virtues, these are like character traits that people have, the way people are disposed to act, feel, think. Okay. And Aristotle, as we're going to see, has a virtue-centered theory as well. Um, but he's going to have some disagreements with the view that virtue is the only thing that contributes to a life being good, or is the only thing that explains why something counts as good in the first place. So Aristotle on goodness, that's our project here. We're talking really about some of the key themes from book one of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So that's how I pronounce it. You'll see other pronunciations elsewhere, but Nicomachean Ethics is how I pronounce it. And Nicomachus is um, believed to have been a son of Aristotle. So this is an ethical treatise, really a set of ethical notes that Aristotle wrote, lecture notes that he had, named after his son. So maybe a tiny bit of biography to help out with the Aristotle. Most likely you've heard of Aristotle, but you may not know some of these details that are coming, but you've heard of him. So those are his dates, 384 to 322. So we're still in that 4th century BCE. So if you think about it, we have Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle back to back to back in the tradition, the fifth through the 4th centuries BCE, if you prefer that. Mm. Um, Aristotle is, again, as many of you may know, he was a student um, of Plato. So Aristotle, he excelled at Plato's academy. So Plato, he opened a school um, in Athens, um, a grove, a grove in Athens that he called the Academy. Um, and his star pupil there ended up being Aristotle. Now, Aristotle himself was from North Africa, which was broadly part of the ancient Greek world at the time. But Aristotle, he knew of the academy. Aristotle was from a family of means, so he was able to study at Plato's academy. But then after a while, um, um, the king of where Aristotle was from in North Africa, basically Macedonia, called for Aristotle to tutor his son Alexander, who became Alexander the Great. So this is another factoid that maybe some of you already know. So Aristotle's someone who's studying at Plato's Academy, prominent school in Athens in the ancient Greek world, and then became the tutor of Alexander, who became Alexander the Great. Eventually Alexander had pretty broad ambitions and decided, well, to take over the attempt to take over the known world at the time, causing a lot of problems in the Greek world and beyond. Um, so um, so he after that happened, after Alexander fled or left Aristotle um, to take up his ambitious project, he founded a school called the Lyceum. So what I have under here, under the tutor of Alexander, the Lyceum, that was a school that Aristotle opened up. So Aristotle thought that he would take over Plato's academy when Plato passed away, but that didn't happen. And so he opened up his own school. And that school ended up having a lot of success. One key difference between the Lyceum and the Academy was that the Lyceum was, you might say, far more scientifically based. So Aristotle in general is a bit more of a scientist, maybe a lot more of a scientist actually than Plato was. So Plato's a philosopher and influenced by Socrates, was deeply interested in moral philosophy, but was interested in a lot more, as it turns out, as Plato breaks away in various ways from Socrates, the moral philosopher, and attempts to develop really his own philosophy, or at least to experiment and see how far various theories could go as he tried to answer a lot of Socrates' questions or similar questions with different types of concepts. Um, but he wasn't a natural philosopher, as they were called back then, but Aristotle definitely was. And in fact, Um, Aristotle's one of the greatest scientists of all time. So in addition to being one of the greatest philosophers, he's one of the greatest scientists as well. Okay, was deeply interested in studying everything, trying to gain all the knowledge of the earth and classifying it in various ways. Okay, so he wrote and lectured voluminously on a wide range of topics, from theology and what we call metaphysics, the study of like what exists generally speaking, to epistemology, theories of knowledge, ethics, to the topics of what we would call science, but what back then called natural philosophy. And he ended up opening up the Lyceum in Athens. So after finding out he wasn't going to take over Plato's academy, he opened up his own school in Athens called the Lyceum. And he lived there until Alexander the Great made enough people angry and um, and passed away. And then, well, what happened was there was a lot of anti North African or Macedonian sentiment in Athens, and Aristotle knew this, and he knew that he was on the wrong side, as it were, on this front. So he fled Athens, lest Athens sin against philosophy twice. The reference here is back to Socrates, who um, who Athens obviously killed. Okay, so that's a brief bit of biography for us. Let's now turn to the philosophy and really to the Nicomachean Ethics, and really just book one. There are 10 books of the Nicomachean Ethics, and we just want to give you a flavor of the ethics by looking at book one, at least some of the key themes from book one. So, big picture point here is one of the main goals of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is to discover and expound upon what in the tradition gets called the highest good for human beings, or the greatest good for human beings. So Aristotle is someone who thinks that there's no such thing as like a universal good for all beings. There's different kinds of good corresponding to different kinds of beings that there are. So what Aristotle would need ultimately is an account of all the different kinds of beings that exist, and he was very deeply interested in that project, as you can imagine. But of course, one kind of thing that exists would be human beings. If you want to get a sense of the other kinds of things that exist, generally speaking, you might be thinking about plants and animals, and then also human beings. Are there other things? Well, yeah, of course there are. But if we're interested in the kinds of things that make a life go well, then we're interested in living things. And then there just might be three kinds of living things. Okay, humans, animals, and plants. And the good for or the highest good for plant life or for an animal life is going to be different than what it is for a human life. And Aristotle is in the tradition which has it that all living things have souls, just souls of different kinds. So plants have a particular kind of soul, vegetative souls, okay, souls that can take in nutrients, the sunlight, and all the rest to grow. Animals have that, have those aspects in their soul. Then, but they also have what he calls sense perception, ability to sense perceive the world, and locomotion, the ability to move around with one soul. Okay, and then human beings have, well, those too. They have vegetative and this sense perception or animative soul. And then there's, for us, rationality. So all living things have souls. It's just the human being soul is more complicated. And then the different goods will correspond to the various kinds of souls that the relevant entity has. The various kinds of good lives would correspond to the kinds of souls that there are. So book one of the Nicomachean Ethics sets a stage for this project. So again, just want to give you a flavor of the theory of the good life, of the highest good. So the highest good is going to be the greatest of the intrinsic goods. Now, if you have a theory, which it seems like Socrates does, then the highest good is virtue, because there's only one thing that's intrinsically good, and that's virtue. Okay, but you might have a theory like Aristotle is going to, where we have multiple things that count as intrinsically good. Well, what's the greatest among the intrinsic goods? Right, that'd be the highest good. Okay. Now, you know, Aristotle's theory is going to be, you know, a little different, as we're going to see. And I'll see if I can try to explain what I mean here, because there's a way in which all the set of goods that Aristotle wants to identify will be organized into like a whole, as it were. Okay, and it's having these goods that would explain explain why that life counts as one that's exemplifying the highest good, if I can put it that way. Okay, so I'll see if I can make good on that explication here. So recall that an intrinsic good, just by way of reminder, is something that is good in itself, good for its own sake, and it's non-derivatively good. Okay, so it doesn't derive its goodness from something else. It already has the relevant goodness. Okay, this very significant goodness. So the highest good is thus the greatest good in itself, the greatest good for its own sake, and the greatest non-derivative good. Now, think about the highest good. Aristotle claims that one claims that it's the greatest superordinate good. It's another way he describes it. The good to which all other goods are subordinate. Okay. And that's consistent with some of the subordinate goods being intrinsically good. Okay. That's just a way of capturing the idea that the highest good will be the greatest of the intrinsic goods, the most important or significant of the intrinsic goods. So, so there's almost like a hierarchy of goodness that Aristotle claims exists in his works. Okay, so it's going to be the thing that sits at the top. Okay, and all subordinate goods are going to be goods that, in some sense, lead up to to the highest good, to the greatest good, to the superordinate good, or to the greatest superordinate good. Because really, being subordinate and being subordinate, they're relative notions. So, you know, money might bring you health, which brings you happiness. Okay, just consider that possibility. Well, money's subordinate to health. Okay, but so then health is superordinate in relation to money, but it's subordinate in relation. Health is subordinate in relation to happiness. Okay, and maybe happiness is itself then subordinate to virtue, for example. So the point is that superordinate and subordinate goods can be relative. Of course, there's the greatest superordinate good. That's going to be something that would hold absolutely. Okay. So I'm describing it this way in part because this is one of the ways that Aristotle describes it. And two, Aristotle sought the highest good in relation to the best human life, which I've anticipated roughly in my language already. Not just moments in a life, but rather a whole life. Okay, so not just a summer in someone's life, but a few decades in that life. Okay, so The highest good is something that's going to be long lasting. The best human life is going to be one where you have goodness sustained continuously for a long time in a life. And then Aristotle claims that um, whatever theorists might think about, uh, whatever philosophers might think about the happy life or the life exemplifying the highest good um, is happiness, according to many. So according to common belief, which Aristotle takes very seriously, the happy life is the best life, the life exemplifying the highest good. And what Aristotle wants to claim is that that's true. In a way, he wants to try to vindicate what the happy life would be like. Okay, he says that there's a lot of debate about what the happy life involves, right? So the common people, um, they think, well, naturally, the best human life would be one where there's sustained, long-lasting happiness or contentment in that life. And Aristotle, in a way, wants to vindicate that by giving an objective way of understanding what a happy life would be like. Okay. So he takes very seriously this common belief. He just thinks that the common belief, though right in a way, needs to be properly understood and developed philosophically. So it's kind of this cool methodology that Aristotle invokes, and it's start with what appears to be true, and perhaps what appears to be true to many, and then see if that ends up being the right theory. And in many ways, it's like if you start with what seems to be true, what appears to be true, then in a way you're starting with the more obvious and working your way to the less obvious in your theorizing. So it's kind of an interesting methodology that many subsequent philosophers have adopted. So some people, when they come to philosophy, they just think that you're sort of just idea sailing, and there's no, what's the word? There's no methodology, there's no rigor behind it. But Aristotle is someone who's very rigorous in his thinking and very methodological. And this is one of the key aspects of his methodology. So Aristotle helps us figure out what the highest good is, or what the happy life is, I could put it that way, by thinking about other theories of the highest good and learning from their shortcomings as we go along. So he develops perhaps 5 such lives. I'm going to only talk about a few of them, not all 5. I think some of them are more worth talking about than others. And again, I just want to give you a good sense of what's going on in that first book of the Nicomachean Ethics. Well, some argue that the best human life is the pleasant life. This theory is known as hedonism. Okay, so the hedonist view is that the way someone lives a good life is by accruing as much pleasure as they can in their life. Okay, so the basic units of goodness for someone are pleasant experiences. Okay, and then that gets worked out in different ways. Pleasure has to be properly understood. You have to define whether pleasures are like attitudes, pro-attitudes to things, or if they're felt experiences, etc. There's lots of work that would have to be done. That's one kind of theory that Aristotle considers. Okay, a life of enjoyment, a life of pleasant enjoyment. Aristotle claims though pleasure is intrinsically good, okay, as we'll see, he'll say virtue is as well, but though pleasure is intrinsically good for us. So it significantly contributes in a basic or fundamental way to living a good life. The pleasant life is a life fit for grazing animals too. Okay. So pleasant experiences, you might say, is what we share in common with animals. They can have pleasant experiences. And the kind of animal that Aristotle considers uh, is grazing animals, right? Think like, cows. Okay. Okay, so you might see how this argument would go. It's like, if hedonism is true, then the human life is really, or the aim of human life, or the best human life is no better than the life of a grazing animal. But of course, that's wrong. So hedonism is wrong. Okay, so I say compare this line of argument with John Stuart Mill. So he's a philosopher, um, an important moral and political philosopher from the 19th century, Great Britain. Many of you likely heard of him. He's the author of a work called Utilitarianism. Another work is On Liberty that he wrote. But he argues that something very similar, but regarding only some forms of hedonism, forms of hedonism that he wants to distance his own theory of hedonism from, as it turns out. So Aristotle is not a hedonist. John Stuart Mill was, but in a way, John Stuart Mill wants to be a hedonist in a way that captures the spirit of Aristotle's challenge and avoids the problem that Aristotle identifies with hedonism. Okay, so that's just some background that might be helpful. If you want to look more into John Stuart Mill, let me know. I'll help you out with that. Just the point here is just that Aristotle develops this kind of argument against hedonism. It was so influential that 2,000 plus years later, you have a philosopher like John Stuart Mill who picks up on the argument and says, oh, but I'm going to develop a hedonism that takes very seriously this challenge from Aristotle and others in the tradition, as it turns out. Okay, so what's wrong with the happy life, the best human life, the life exemplifying the highest good being the pleasant life? Well, it's like that life is a life that's also perfectly good for and best for grazing animals. But presumably, just add one more layer here, human lives can be better than animal lives. And some of you might be saying, hold on, but that's widely accepted in the history of philosophy. And not until recent times did philosophers think to even question that point. So I'll just leave it at that and move on. The second kind of life that Aristotle considers, or at least another kind of life that Aristotle considers, is the honor life, the life of honor. And I'm going to call this the honor theory of the highest good, just to give it a name. So we have hedonism, and then we have the honor theory. According to this view, what constitutes the best human life is a life where the person in question is given a lot of honor. You might say the honor life or the honorable life, the person who gains a lot of honor from other people for being courageous or for other reasons, for being intelligent, whatever it turns out to be. But Aristotle says that this life that's filled with honor, won't count as the best human life because it's too dependent on the people who bestow honor on others than on the person who has the honor. Okay. Moreover, he wants to claim that it's really too superficial to count as something that could serve as that being honored or the life of honor is too superficial a life to count as one that we would consider upon reflection as the best human life. Okay, it's nice to get honor, right? But it's too superficial to care so much about honor that you would go about trying to get it such that you live a good human life. Okay, so Aristotle's kind of quick about the superficiality point, but he's not quick on the first point. Okay, it's too dependent on people who bestow honor rather than on the person who has the honor. In a way, it's like Aristotle and other places says that whatever good or goods contribute to the best human life, those things have to be in a way kind of self-sufficient and not dependent on other things. And well, honor is the kind of good that's dependent on other things, other people, and how and their attitude toward one. Okay, now another theory of the highest good is the virtuous life. This is the virtue theory of the highest good. This is perhaps Socrates' theory, or Plato's through Socrates' theory. And Aristotle says, yeah, virtue is intrinsically good. So now we have pleasure and we have virtue for Aristotle, which counts as intrinsically good. Moreover, it's the most important part of what makes the best human life, but it alone isn't the highest good because someone could have virtue but deal with lifelong suffering. So, according to Aristotle, we can imagine someone who's virtuous, but they've just had a lot of bad luck with respect to deaths in their lives, or other misfortunes that come their way. And presumably that wouldn't be the best life. The best human life would be one that's lucky enough to avoid a lot of suffering. Okay. So the virtue theory is gonna fail. Okay. Now, someone like Socrates thinks um, that the virtuous person will be looked after by the gods, in such a way that they don't have to worry about suffering. Okay. So he kind of has built into his theory this idea that the gods will reward those who are virtuous. Aristotle's clear that common sense tells us that there can be people who are virtuous who could suffer a great deal in their lives. Those in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and even the Islamic tradition, because many Muslim theologians, at the very least, think that Christians and Jews are people of the book, and there's a lot of agreement on what's called the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament of the Bible, um, that um, that's held in common between these traditions. And there's the story of Job, which many of you may know, Job, Job, and Job, someone who was righteous. And one day the devil comes before God and says, "Hey, God, allow me to tempt your servant, your righteous servant Job, and um, he'll curse. I'll bring him to his knees and make him curse you." And God's like, "Okay, go ahead." And so he brings misery upon this righteous person. His friends tell him that he must be a sinner. His wife turns against him. His fortune flees. He's left suffering with leprosy and other forms of ill health, while his friends badmouth him and tell him that he must have lived poorly. He must not be righteous. Well, according to the story of Job, he was righteous. It's just that the devil wanted to get Job to curse God. Okay. So it seems like people could be virtuous or righteous, but still suffer a great deal. And that wouldn't be the best human life. Okay, Aristotle and the highest good, continuing, as we try to round out his view a bit here. And again, we're talking about the life that exemplifies the highest good, the best human life. The best human life is going to have a lot of goodness in it. And the basic building blocks of the goodness, of course, will be the intrinsic goods. So the life exemplifying the highest good will include virtue and pleasure without being identical to either or both. So that is, neither the virtuous life nor the pleasant life by themselves are the best human lives. And we've seen why that's the case. So the virtuous life isn't the best human life because, well, it's consistent with lots of suffering throughout the life. The pleasant life itself isn't the best human life because that's also a life fit for grazing animals. And a virtuous life that is also a pleasant life isn't sufficient for being the best life, because you can imagine someone living a virtuous life and also living a pleasant life, um, but perhaps something else is needed. And here, Aristotle points to good fortune and good legacy. And there's debates how exactly to fit these in with Aristotle's theory, but he tends to think that you need to have the good fortune to make the virtuous life and the pleasant life last for long periods of time. And you also need like a good legacy. So Aristotle tends to think that if someone dies, having lived a good life up to the point where they die, and then their legacy is tarnished by lies or something thereafter, or their family members go on to live in shameful kinds of ways, then the person's life is less valuable. The person's, you might say, well-being has been compromised. Okay. So we need to, at the very least, also have good fortune and a good legacy. And there may be other things in addition. So we have virtue, we have pleasure, we have good luck or good fortune, and a good legacy as things that contribute in a very essential way to living the best human life. And Aristotle thinks this is all in line with um, careful thinking about um, what we tend to think about the best human life when we think about it just ordinarily, when we sit back and reflect on some of the key thoughts that we have about it. Okay, so Aristotle and the highest good, virtue. So according to Aristotle, virtue is the most important aspect of the highest good. It's the most important aspect of living the best human life. So virtue is like the most important of the intrinsic goods. So in a way, one way to carve things up is this highest good. The highest good, the greatest of all the intrinsic goods is going to be virtue for Aristotle. Okay, but he insists on claiming that there's multiple things that are intrinsically good and they contribute to living the best overall human life. Okay. Of course, we know that a virtuous person is someone who could end up with lots of unhappiness. So that's at least one common reason that Aristotle gives for why um, uh, virtue itself isn't enough to live the best human life. Well, but what is human virtue? I've kind of just been hinting at some of the cardinal virtues or classical virtues. One, think about wisdom, courage, justice, moderation, honesty, generosity, these kinds of things. As examples of things that would be virtues, hoping that you have a sense of what those things mean. Okay, but we can say more. Um, so for Aristotle, human virtue is human excellence. So just like it was for Socrates, virtue is excellence. And here we're focusing on human virtue. So human virtue is going to be human excellence. But human excellence, according to Aristotle, essentially involves excellent rationality. Okay, so how do humans become excellent? Excellent. How do humans become virtuous? Well, they exercise their rationality excellently, because rationality is what distinguishes us from plants and what distinguishes us from um, uh, plants and animals. Okay, and coheres with the kind of soul that we have. We have a rational soul. And three, thus, from one and two, we can conclude that human virtue involves excellent rationality. Okay. So by excellent rationality, I mean by using one's rationality in an excellent kind of way. But what's excellent rationality? Well, it's obviously related to using human reason excellently. So when we think about the kinds of faculties that we have, that we find ourselves with, we find rationality. We also find sense experience. We find introspection, um, proprioception, the ability to know like where your body is without having to think much about it, or where parts of your body are without having to think much about it. So rationality is one way in which or one tool you might say that we're designed to have or that we're evolved to have that guides us in um, understanding the world around us, etc., or figuring out how we're going to live our lives. So rationality, going as far back as Aristotle at the very least, typically is claimed to have two kinds, the theoretical and the practical. So the theoretical part of human reason, if it's helpful, let me go back and escape out of this real quick. This might be helpful. It's really concerned with belief, in particular, true belief. So true belief seems essential, or knowledge. Whoops. Of course, knowledge is going to require true belief. So those of you who have studied your Meno, you know this. Okay. And on the practical side of things, we've got correct action. So a way of thinking about like um, rationality, it's just part of our cognition, a part of our mind, if I could put it that way, that's developed to guide us in um, helping us gain true beliefs about the world or knowledge or understanding of the world that we're living in, whereas practical reason is what guides us in our correct acting, including moral action. Okay. So we have these helps, we have these faculties, and these faculties contribute to um, our, you might say, two main ways of interacting with the world around us. So these are central, I mean, general things we're dealing with in our lives. Right? Knowing, understanding, or forming true beliefs about the world, and then changing the world such that we act well in that world, we act correctly within that world. So two central, questions or human endeavors, more exactly: gaining knowledge or gaining true beliefs about the world, gaining understanding of the world we're living in, and acting correctly in the world, like acting correctly toward ourselves, comporting ourselves correctly towards others, etc. Human reason guides us. So we act excellently when we act theoretically excellently, we act virtuously when we act theoretically virtuously, and the same thing holds with respect to practical reason or practical rationality. Okay. So just maybe a bit more on Aristotle on virtue. So he thinks that virtue is a state of the soul, and it's a state of the soul that's a mean between two extremes, between deficiency on the one hand and excess on the other. Okay, it's a mean state, meaning that it's a golden mean state, meaning that it's this intermediate state between extremes that we can put our soul in, and we can habituate our souls to be disposed to feel, act, and think in various ways. Just to give you a flavor of how this series is supposed to go. What is this? What is the state of the soul? Courage. Well, it's a state where someone has like the right response or attitude to fear. Okay, they're not deficient in their response to fear, and they're not excess in their response to fear in the relevant kinds of ways. So courage is the intermediate state between cowardice and rashness. Generosity is the intermediate state between stinginess and extravagance, ambition between sloth and greed, modesty between humility and pride, and honesty is this mean state between secrecy and loquacity, or gossiping, saying too much. There's a whole host of other examples. Uh, Now, it's important to note that for uh, Aristotle, virtue or the golden mean isn't just or being in a state where the golden mean is properly instantiated or manifested. Um, isn't like this doctrine of moderation that people like to bandy about, where people say things like, "Oh, moderation, all things in moderation." Aristotle would be deeply opposed. He's explicitly opposed to that and says, no, um, living a virtuous life, achieving or attaining this intermediate state of the soul between extremes is an extreme state in its own right. That takes a lot of effort and a lot of work to achieve these intermediate states of the soul. In fact, Aristotle seems to think that you're very unlikely to achieve these states unless you were raised well, unless you come from a good family that raised you correctly with respect to um, instilling, you might say, these intermediate states, these golden mean states of the soul. Okay, so what Aristotle wants to say is that there's no there's no intermediate state of cowardice or rashness. There's no, he says in one place, there's no uh, intermediate state of adultery. Okay, so it's not the an intermediate state or moderation in all things. It's an intermediate state, which is an extreme state between these other kinds of extreme states. It's just that this is we'll talk about the balance state here. This is an extreme state um, because it takes a lot to hit the target. Okay, so one of the examples that Aristotle likes to use is that of the archer, or the archery example, where it takes a lot of practice to get your bow, in line with the target with your arrow, and that you actually hit the target. So there's so many ways of going wrong, and only so few, if not one way of going right. Okay. So imagine a very, very narrow bullseye where you can only fit the arrow in exact perfectly if you hit it dead on, and that's it. Think about all the other ways that you could miss, right? Hopefully you're hitting the target. Hopefully you're hitting the target, but not you know even if you miss the bullseye, but still, hopefully you catch the point. So let's not confuse Aristotle's theory of the golden mean with these kind of trite expressions of moderation in all things you hear people talk about. Okay. So what's Aristotle's view on pleasure? Just a few things I want to say about this, because he does insist that it's an intrinsic good. And as such, it's an essential part of the highest good, living the best human life. But pleasure needs to be tempered or moderated. 1A, it leads to, is because pleasure leads people to do bad things. People will do bad things if they're enticed by enough pleasure. And pleasure will also prevent people from doing good things. So lots of people would avoid doing good if that meant that they would get pleasure for doing so. Okay, so so this 1A, someone might commit adultery on their spouse because of the pleasure they might get from engaging in the adulterous acts. That would be an example of 1A. And also the pleasure that one might get from sort of sitting around and watching, um, you know, junk TV all day or something like that might prevent people from going out and studying, doing their Phil 231. No, might prevent people from actually being productive and going out and doing good things in the world, helping other people, that kind of thing. So those are just examples of 1A and 1B. Okay. So Aristotle is really clear. He's like, the good life has to have pleasure, has to have a lot of it. We have to be careful about the kind of pleasure that we allow ourselves to consume, given 1A and 1B on this slide. So 2, he says, a virtuous life will generally be pleasant, though, because the virtuous enjoy living virtuously. So one of the most relevant kinds of pleasures that Aristotle is interested in the Nicomachean Ethics is the kind of pleasure that comes from living a virtuous life. So then the virtuous life, well, it'll very likely be a pleasant life as well. Still, the happy life is going to include things like having good fortune for long periods of time and having a good legacy after you die. Okay, so virtue and pleasure are central to the best human life. Virtue is the most important, as Aristotle claims. Okay. So I think that's what I have for thinking about Aristotle on the good. One of the big picture ways I like to understand his view is he says that common belief is that happiness is the highest good. And then he tries to understand, like, what could that possibly mean? And he runs through some lives and realizes, well, we can learn from these lives that we've just gone through. And the happy life, the best human life, the life exemplifying the highest good, is going to be a virtuous life. It's going to be therefore a pleasant life. It's also going to be a life that has lots of good fortune, and it'll be a life uh, where one's legacy isn't tarnished or otherwise damaged after one passes away. Okay, so that's Aristotle on the good life. We'll stop here, and very soon we'll be moving on to another philosopher, Epicurus, who's going to give a hedonist theory of the highest good, of the best human life. All right, so let me stop sharing. Wish you all well, and please reach out with any questions that you may have. Bye-bye.